afternoon. I'm Shoma Chaudhary, and I'm extremely honored to be here today to talk about this session of Behind Closed Doors. In this era of chilling and terrifying terror acts, it's very easy to think of violence as something that others do. But this session will bring the capacity for violence much closer home, making it evident that there's a kind of disconcerting and almost pervasive cultural phenomenon. In Eastern and Middle Eastern societies, we're very fortunate to have a huge power structure, a support structure that is provided by millions of working women who participate in our homes as domestic help. But in many ways, this is the ugliest aspect of our societies, one of our greatest blind spots. The clip that you just saw about this lady is in a way the most extreme manifestation of the spectrum of violence that these workers face. This is the story of Kasturi Muniratnam, which 2 months ago made international headlines and became a diplomatic incident as she tried to escape her employer's home and lost her arm. This story is symptomatic. This tragic story is symptomatic of what happens to millions of other workers. But before we get to that, we're very, very fortunate to have Kasturi's family here today, her sister Vijaya and her son Mohan. And thank you for coming here. It's very courageous of them at a time like this to share their story with us. Both of them speak only in Tamil, so we have Parvati, who will be translating for them as they share their story with us. Vijay, I wanted to start with you. Could you just explain the circumstances that led Kasturi to go to Saudi Arabia?
அவங்க என்னத்துக்காக போனாங்க அவங்க வந்து வீட்டு வறுமை அவங்களோட கஷ்டம் கடன் தொல்லை அதனால அவங்க சவுதிக்கு போய் வேலை செய்ய போனாங்க.
Extreme poverty and a huge loan is what forced Kasturi to try the option of going to Gulf to earn some money.
I'll just quickly share with you that Kasturi had 3 daughters and her son Mohan, and she'd married off her daughters and acquired a huge loan in paying for those marriages, and that was part of the reason why they were in such a state of poverty. And her husband is extremely ill with asthma, and that is, why Kasturi went to Saudi Arabia. Vijay, what was the circumstance in which you first got to know that Kasturi was hurt? And can you describe what really happened to her in Saudi Arabia?
என்ன ஆச்சு அவங்களுக்கு சவுதி அரேபியாலன்னா உங்களுக்கு எப்போ தெரிய வந்தது, எப்படி தெரிய வந்தது?
அவங்க போயிட்டு 2 months ஆகுது சவுதிக்கு போயிட்டு வேலை செய்ய போனாங்க, வீட்டு வேலை செய்கிறதுக்கு. அவங்க வீட்டு வேலை செஞ்சு ஒன் வீக்கு தான் அவங்க நல்லா பார்த்துக்கிட்டாங்க அவங்கள. அதுக்கப்புறம் போக போக அவங்க வந்து அவங்களுக்கு சாப்பாடு கொடுக்கல, வீட்டில் ரொம்ப வேலை வைக்கிறது, ஜாஸ்தி வேலை வைக்கிறது, சாப்பாடு கொடுக்கல, சம்பளம் கொடுக்கல. 2 மாதம் ஆகியும் கடைசியாக டைமை வந்து அவங்க சம்பளம் கேட்டு அவங்க மாமியார் இறந்துட்டாங்க, அதுக்காக வீட்டுக்கு வரணும்னு சொல்லி அவங்க கேட்டுக்கிட்டாங்க அந்த ஹவுஸ் ஓனர்கிட்ட. அப்போ கேட்கும்போது அவங்க வந்து அனுப்ப முடியாதுன்னு சொல்லிட்டாங்க.
She went and everything was okay for just about a week. And then later, she wouldn't be given anything to eat the whole day. She would work for 14 hours and 16 hours. She wasn't paid for the 2 months that she worked there. And when she got a call from her son saying that the grandmother had passed away, she was very confused. She didn't know whether it was her mother-in-law who had passed away or it was her husband who had passed away. And she wanted to come home. She asked her employer to be allowed to go home, which predictably she wasn't. And that's when things started really becoming difficult for Kasturi.
அதுக்கு பிறகு அவங்க வந்து அவங்க போலீஸ் அவங்க வந்து ரவுண்ட்ஸ் வருவாங்க. எப்பவும் அவங்க விசாரிப்பாங்க, அந்த வேலை செய்கிற ஹவுஸ் ஓனர்கிட்ட வந்து விசாரிச்சப்போ அந்த போலீஸ்கிட்ட போயிட்டு அவங்க இன்ஃபார்ம் பண்ணிட்டாங்க, எனக்கு வந்து சாப்பாடு கொடுக்கறதில்ல, சம்பளம் கொடுக்கல, எனக்கு நிறைய வேலை வைக்கிறாங்க, நான் வீட்டுக்கு போகணுன்னு சொல்லியிருக்காங்க.
The same day that she heard from her son, later in the day, the state-appointed inspectors came around who were supposed to randomly inspect and talk to people who were working if they faced any problems. And Kasturi narrated her entire ordeal to those inspectors. But once the inspectors left, Kasturi immediately realized that she had done something which is going to really infuriate her employer. She took the help of a Pakistani driver, called her son, because the employer wasn't allowing her to speak to her son. And she told her son, this is what had happened, and I I fear for my life.
But
அப்புறம் என்னாச்சு?
can you describe the exact circumstance of how she fell and how did she lose her arm?
அவங்க எப்படி என்ன காரணத்தினால கீழே விழுந்தாங்க, கை எப்படி போச்சு, அதை பற்றி எதானு சொல்லுங்க.
அவங்க வந்து போலீஸில் அவங்க கிட்ட போலீஸில் சொல்லிட்ட பிறகு அவங்க என்ன அவங்களை கூப்பிட்டு அந்த ஓனரை கூப்பிட்டு போலீஸ் விசாரணை பண்ணாங்க. விசாரணை பண்ணும்போது அவங்க வந்து கூப்பிட்டு விசாரிச்சிட்டாங்க. அன்றைக்கி நைட்டு என்ன ஆக போதோ தெரியல. அந்த அந்த சவுதி இதில் வந்து அந்த கத்திக்கு பேர் ஏதோ சொல்கிறாங்க. அந்த கத்தி பேர் சொன்ன உடனே அவங்க கொலை பண்ண தான் என்ன வராங்க. ஏன்னா போலீஸில் நான் கம்ப்ளைண்ட் பண்ணிட்டேன், அதனால் என்னை கொலை பண்ண போகிறாங்க அன்றைக்கி நைட்டு அப்படின்னு அவங்க ஆளெல்லாம் டைம் பார்த்து ஆளெல்லாம் வர வச்சுட்டு அதனால என்ன பண்ணாங்க, சாரியில் கட்டி ஒரு பெட்டில் சாரியை கட்டி 2 சாரி கட்டி ஜன்னல் வழியாக தப்பிச்சு வர்றதுக்காக கட்டினாங்க.
Since Kasturi couldn't speak anything but Tamil, once she got to Riyadh, she communicated with her employer through signs. She would point to a particular object and ask what it was called. By that, she had become familiar with many words, including the Arabic for knife. After the inspectors went, the employer was interrogated and warned. At this point, Kasturi heard her employer talk to somebody over phone. She kind of understood that the employer was asking that person to come with a knife. That's the point where Kasturi really feared for her life and she decided to escape. She went to her room, tied a sari to the bedpost, tied another one, put it outside the window, and started climbing down.
அப்புறம் கட்டி கீழே இறங்கும்போது மேலே இப்படி பிடிச்சிக்கிட்டே இப்படி கீழே இறங்கும்போது அவங்க வந்து கையை கட் பண்ணிட்டாங்க கத்தியில். ஹவுஸ் ஓனர் கட் பண்ணிட்டோன்னா கீழே அப்படியே விழுந்துட்டாங்க.
As she was climbing down and looking down, she just heard a loud thwack on her arm. And after that, she doesn't remember anything at all.
Just to pick up the story here, when Kasturi woke up, she was in hospital and her arm was gone. There is now a big dispute about whether her employer chopped her hand off at the moment she fell. There's one story which says that when she reached the hospital, her arm was in a packet. That Pakistani driver saw her there and took her to the hospital. And there's another version which says that the hospital had to amputate her hand because they couldn't save it. And that, there are other versions that she cut herself on a generator as she fell. But I think those details are not, as germane as the terror that drove Kasturi to jump out of a window to save herself. And the deep isolation that she felt, not being able to speak a language, the terror of being behind closed doors, and, living at the mercy of the people who would barely give her a slice of bread or one roti to eat the entire day. I just want to bring Mohan in at this moment. Mohan, what is the thing you most regret? What allowed you to send your mother to Saudi Arabia? And, in our cultures, normally a son will work first rather than get their mother to work. Why were you not able to go to Saudi Arabia? And what do you regret most about this whole incident?
இந்த முழு சம்பவத்துக்கும் உங்களுக்கு எதை பற்றி வருத்தம் எல்லாத்தோடையும் ஜாஸ்தி?
குடும்ப சூழ்நிலையில் தான் கஷ்டம் ரொம்ப. அம்மாவுக்கு வந்து கை வெட்டாங்க, இதுக்கப்புறம் எந்த வேலையும் செய்ய முடியாது.
His regret is the intense poverty and the challenges of the huge loan that they face, which forced his mother to take the step to go to Riyadh and lose her arm and livelihood altogether. நீங்கள் உங்களுக்கு சான்ஸ் கிடைச்சா நீங்கள் போவீங்களா? நீங்கள் ஏன் போகல?
இல்லைங்க, எனக்கு கால் அடிபட்டு செய்து போக முடியாது, வீட்டு வேலையை செய்ய முடியாது.
He fell down while working on a roof or something and busted his knees, which means that he cannot really do anything strenuous. So he doesn't feel that he will get a chance to go to Riyadh.
We're almost going to be out of time, so I just want to share a quick detail about the story again, about their circumstances before we move to Vijaya again, which is that Kasturi has, several sisters, but they have different stations in life. Vijaya moved away to Chennai and lives a better life than her sister. They're only a little bit, Vijaya is the only connect she has with her family now. But the daughters for whom she raised that debt actually their husbands divorced them or left them, and the daughters are back in their home now with 5 children. So in effect, Kasturi has an asthmatic husband, a son whose leg is broken and cannot do hard labor, and now both her daughters and 5 children, so that's 6 adults and 7 children that are now dependent on Kasturi, who no longer has an arm. Vijaya, can you quickly share, because we're almost out of time, the difficulty in getting her back? And now she is back in India. Has any investigation happened? That agent, was he someone that you knew? Can you quickly tell us a little about that?
அவங்கள எப்படி கூட்டிட்டு வந்தீங்க திருப்பி?
ஏஜென்ட் வந்து இந்த மாதிரி கார் ஆக்சிடெண்ட்டில் வந்து உங்கள் அம்மாவுக்கு அடிபட்டுது அப்படின்னு சொல்லிட்டு ஏஜென்ட் அன்றைக்கி ஈவினிங் வந்து சொன்னாங்க. வந்து சொன்ன உடனே இவங்க வந்து ரொம்ப பிள்ளைங்க நாங்கள் எல்லாம் அப்படியே பதறி போனோம். அவங்க என்ன வெறும் ஆக்சிடெண்ட் மட்டும்தான் சொன்னாங்க. அன்றைக்கி நைட்டே வந்து கேரளாவிலேருந்து ஜோமேஸ் என்றவர் வந்து ஃபோன் பண்ணி அந்த ஃபோட்டோலாம் ஒன்று அனுப்பி வச்சு, இவங்க அம்மா வந்து ரொம்ப சீரியஸாக இருக்காங்க, ரொம்ப அவங்கள வந்து பெரிய லெவலில் போனால் தான் நீங்கள் கொண்டு வர முடியும் உயிரோட, நீங்கள் அந்த லெவலுக்கு போகணுங்க அப்படின்னு சொன்னவொடனே எம்பி அந்த மாதிரி மினிஸ்டர் அந்த மாதிரி லெவலில் போனீங்கன்னா தான் அவங்கள உயிரோட கொண்டு வர முடியும்னு எங்கள்கிட்ட சொன்னாங்க. அப்போ நான் உடனே வந்து அந்த எனக்கு ஃப்ரெண்டாக இருந்தாங்க ஒருத்தர், அவங்க கூட முன்னாள் அமைச்சர் இந்திரகுமாரி, அவங்கக்கிட்ட போய் நான் அழுதேன். இந்த மாதிரி எங்கள் அக்காவை எப்படியாவது உயிரோட கொண்டு வரணுமா அப்படின்னு சொல்லிட்டு நான் அழுதேன். அப்போ அவங்க உடனே எம்பசிக்கு ஒரு லெட்டர் எழுதினாங்க. இதை அவங்களோட சூழ்நிலைலாம் வச்சு அந்த ஃபோட்டோ அவங்க கட் பண்ண அந்த ஃபோட்டோ அனுப்பி வச்சுருந்தாங்க. அந்த ஃபோட்டோ வச்சு நாங்கள் எம்பசிக்கு சென்ட்ரல் மினிஸ்டர் அவங்களுக்கு எம்பசிக்கு அப்புறம் சென்னையில் வந்து சிஎம் அவங்களுக்கு வந்து தமிழ்நாடு ஸ்டேட் கவர்மெண்ட்டுக்கு வந்து ஃபேக்ஸ் அனுப்பிட்டு நாங்கள் உடனே வந்து எம்பி கனிமொழி அவங்களையும் திருச்சி சிவா அவங்ககிட்ட போய் பார்த்து அவங்க வந்து இம்மீடியட்டாக நம்ம மத்திய அரசாங்கத்தை வலியுறுத்தி உடனே நம்ம அங்கே இருக்கிற சவுதி இருக்கிற எம்பசிக்கு வந்து ஃபோன் பண்ணி எல்லாம்னா அவங்களுக்கு கண்டிப்பாக அவங்கள நல்லபடியாக அவங்களுக்கு எந்த ஒரு ஆபத்தும் இல்லை, உயிருக்கு ஆபத்து இல்லாத மாதிரி உடனே கொண்டு வரணும். அவங்கள எந்த பாதுகாப்பும் அவங்களுக்கு மருத்துவ உதவிகளை செய்யணும். அதுக்கப்புறம் அவங்கள வந்து நல்லபடியாக கொண்டு வந்து ஊரை சீக்கிரம் அப்படின்னு சொல்கிறதுக்காக அங்கே இருக்கிற எம்பசி இந்தியன் சோஷியல் ஃபோரம் என்ற ஒரு அமைப்பு அவங்கெல்லாம் சேர்ந்து தான் அவங்க வந்து கொண்டு வந்தாங்க.
The first information about Kasturi not being well came from the local broker, who on the day of the incident came and told Mohan that she had met with an accident, a car accident, road accident, and she was hospitalized. But later that evening, Mohan got a call from Kerala, a gentleman whose sister was a nurse who was attending to Kasturi in the hospital. And he informed Mohan that she was in a critical condition and they should do whatever, get in touch with the higher-ups and do whatever it takes to get her back home alive. That's when Mohan got in touch with Vijaya, and they used whatever contacts they had, approached the Tamil Nadu government, the central government, the embassy at Riyadh, and they all swung into action with the help of the media and managed to get Kasturi back home last month.
Just one last thing before, we thank you for being here, is that, Vijaya, is there anything that you can do? Is your husband supportive? Every time you've spoken of your sister, you've started to cry. Do you think that you could have helped her financially and stopped her from going to Saudi Arabia?
நீங்கள் உங்கள் அக்கா கஸ்தூரிய பண உதவி செஞ்சு அவங்கள கல்ஃப் போகாமல் நிறுத்த முடிஞ்சிருக்குமா?
எனக்கும் நானும் ஒரு மிடில் கிளாஸ் தான். நானும் கஷ்டப்பட்டு என் குழந்தைங்கள தான் 3 பிள்ளைங்க எனக்கு படிக்க வச்சேன். அவங்க படித்து ஓரளவுக்கு. ஆனால் எங்கள் ஹஸ்பண்ட் வந்து ஒரு கடை தான், ஒரு சர்வீஸ் கடை தான் வச்சுருந்தார் எங்கள் ஹஸ்பண்ட். அவ்வளோ நான் வசதியாக இருந்தால் கண்டிப்பாக பார்த்துருப்பேன் அவங்கள எல்லாரையும். இருந்தாலும் அவங்களுக்கு ஒரு சின்ன சின்ன ஹெல்ப்பெல்லாம் நான் பண்ணுவேன். படிக்கிறது, அந்த குழந்தைங்க படிக்கிற ஹெல்ப்பு, அதெல்லாம் கூட நான் செஞ்சுருக்கிறேன். ஓரளவுக்கு என்னால் செய்ய முடியும். அதுக்கு மேலே என் குடும்பமும் ஒரு மிடில் கிளாஸ் ஃபேமிலி தானே.
She says, I couldn't have helped beyond whatever little I do because I'm not that well off. The problem here is Kasturi is bogged down by a huge loan of 25 lakhs. To pay those 25 lakhs, they sold off their house. They managed to pay half of that, and the half still remains. There are 6 adults, 7 children, no house, no regular income. The only breadwinner has lost her livelihood.
I thank you very, very much for being here. There's, the Kasturi story, if it was an isolated case, it would have been okay for it to be headlines. But there's 7 million domestic workers in Saudi Arabia, and they're completely without protection. And we'll see a small film about why Kasturi's story is so powerfully symbolic. Thank you very much for being here.
Kasturi Vijaya has one request. She wants the perpetrators to be brought to justice checks and balances to be put in place so there are no more kasturis, and if possible, a monetary compensation for the loss of livelihood for Kasturi and her family.
எங்களை அழைச்சிட்டு வந்தவங்க ரேவதி அவங்களுக்கு சொல்லணுங்களா?
You know, unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to completely share all the details of that story, but I just wanted to tell you a couple more facts that Mohan, who's largely silent because the sheer oppression that he himself has to face with not being, not being able-bodied and not being literate is something that it is hard for him to speak about. And they have only one cow in that entire household that gives them about 7 liters. They drink half a liter and they sell 6 liters. So far, that's how they've been living. The Tamil Nadu government has set up a corpus of 10 lakhs now for them. So Kasturi is going to be getting a little bit of interest out of which she'll live. But the corpus will go back to the government the day Kasturi passes away. And so we're really seeing the face of illiteracy and disenfranchisement at its worst. We have with us Ratna Begum, who has been working. She works with the Human Rights Watch and has been documenting the millions of thousands of Kasturis that we never get to know about because they don't make the kind of headlines that this story did. So Ratna, I'd like to bring you in here, that what is the kind of impunity that allows employers in Saudi Arabia to treat Kasturi the way they did? And why, despite the diplomatic incident it became with Susma Swaraj and everyone getting involved in it, why has there been so little outcome, so little punishment for what happened to Kasturi?
Thank you. So just to give a bit of context about what's happening here, in the Gulf states, particularly places like Saudi Arabia, you have what's known as the kafala system. This is a visa sponsorship system in which migrant domestic workers are tied to their employer by virtue of their visa, and it means they're not allowed to leave them for the duration of their contract. So, for instance, as Kasturi's case, if she steps outside of that door and she said, "I quit, I cannot work for you anymore," she becomes automatically an undocumented worker and is liable to arrest and deportation. So that itself, the kafala system, is to penalize workers from leaving their employers, and that gives a huge amount of control and power to the employer. In addition, it's places like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, the two countries in the Gulf, they institute what's known as the exit permit system. So you cannot even leave the country. Even if your employer no longer cares about you, you've left them, but you cannot leave the country without their permission.
So Ratna, is there any attention in the media in any of the Gulf countries? Is this a big burning issue there? And are there any moves at all? I know that Saudi Arabia, in fact, ironically, in 2013, passed a bylaw which merely shifted the ground enough to say that after 2 years, workers could have paid leave and that they would work 15 hours a day instead of the 8 hours a day that labor works. But can you help us understand if there are any countries taking any initiative in improving the workers' conditions? And also the plight that domestic workers face, is that common to the way other laborers in the Gulf countries work, or is this a further disenfranchisement?
Sure. So just on your first point in terms of reforms and steps, so coupled with the kafala system is the lack of labor law protection. So all domestic workers have might be just a contract between them and the employer, which is incredibly weak. And the other thing to note in these countries is that there's no national minimum wage. So she could be paid next to nothing, and that would be completely legal. And in addition to that is the access to justice. So even if you are trying to claim your contractual rights, you have to go to the immigration department, and that's incredibly it's a very problematic procedure because as a domestic worker, you're left very vulnerable and you cannot work for another employer during your process of applying for compensation or trying to claim a criminal case against your employer because you cannot work, you do not have a salary, and so you have a pressure of going home.
So in effect, the person you have to complain against holds all the keys to your
Absolutely.
life.
Yes.
Your passport, your visa, your ticket back home, your money, everything.
Everything. And the system actually enforces that, facilitates that abuse. Now, we're seeing some bits of reform, the 2013 Saudi bylaw, which is not great by any means, but that's the first time, 10 years ago, we didn't even know that we would even get legislation on domestic workers. So that was a step forward. The most recent change was in Kuwait, which has about 2/3 domestic workers in its country and is also known to have incredible abuse and exploitation, including of Indian domestic workers. They've passed a domestic workers law in July of this year, which was much more progressive than Saudi Arabia, still weaker than their labor law, but much more progressive.
I'm sorry I'm having to rush through this because we have limited time. But, I was talking about the fact that the violence moves closer and closer home. So we've all heard about, recently there was another incident involving Saudi Arabia. So one could imagine now that this is all to do with regressive Saudi Arabian or Gulf country societies. But Ravi, to come closer home to India, you've been working with trafficking and with rescuing domestic help, as well as young children and women. Can you talk of the circumstances in India? The agent that sent Kasturi to Saudi Arabia. What is this ecology of traffic that is sending and making women so vulnerable?
See, when the economy is on the move,
Ravi, will you talk into the mic?
when the economy is on the move and women are wanting to go out, and that's happening even in the rural areas also. A lot of girls, young girls, women are wanting to come out to make good life. And they get entangled into this organized crime of trafficking because there are a lot of agents, placement agencies, which don't operate under any legislation. They are completely an organized crime. They are bringing in victims from far-flung areas, tribal areas of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha, and bringing them here and then taking some money from people and then putting them into domestic slavery. Let me tell you that in cases, and we do rescue a lot of women and children from sex trafficking also. Sex trafficking outrages us. But in cases of domestic slavery, in which there are a huge number of trafficking happening, it doesn't outrage us. I see policemen, I see prosecutors, I see judges, I see common man talking about that this is not trafficking, this is about work, this is about migration. And when we hear these things, we just want to push things behind the carpet. We just want to remain silent on this issue, on the intense violation which happens in such domestic situation. We have been my organization has been rescuing a lot of victims from domestic slavery. And we find out that in just one and a half years ago, we rescued a young girl from a house where she was beaten up brutally and there was huge gash in her head which had maggots in and the owner wanted to say that she is mad, she is lunatic, and she hits herself. Of course she was rescued and now she is doing well in studies in Sahibganj. But people, in cases of domestic workers, we just want to remain silent. We don't want to talk about minimum wages for our domestic workers. We don't want to give them salaries which are competent. We have to realize that if we go to offices, if we go to work, and we want dignity for ourselves, we should also ensure that dignity happens in our households also. And we should ensure that these workers who are toiling for us, and we have to recognize that this is work, real work, and this is professional work, and they also want the dignity. We want basic minimum wages for them, and what is happening?
Ravi, I'm sorry, I'm just cutting in over here because, what you just said, the economic value of what, in India, there's almost 50 million workers in our homes, but it is such an invisible workforce that even the numbers vary from people saying it's 10 million workers to 50 million workers. That's how invisible the statistics and the infrastructure around domestic help workforce in India is. I wanted to shift slightly. You spoke about rights. Rotna's mentioned that in Saudi Arabia or in Gulf countries, there's no legislative framework. In India, a draft act was filed in 2010.
2010.
Has anything moved, and why is there such reluctance to act on this?
See, nothing happened. The National Commission of Women proposed the law in 2010, and then nothing happened. Because, there is so much reluctance. We don't want to give minimum wages to these domestic workers. Minimum wages in Delhi will be 9,000 rupees. And we don't want, and that is where people are just withholding that act. And also, not only the Domestic Workers Act, even in cases of Kasturi, and even in case of thousands and thousands of young tribal girls being brought from Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, West Bengal, and we have cases of, like you were mentioning the numbers, 130,000 children are going missing in India every year. That's the number. And when these women and children are landing up here, they are being brought here by recruitment agencies, placement agencies, which are just don't under any legislation. We still don't have any legislation for placement agency. And this puts the children, the women, all their lives in risk. And also the people for whom they work, because sometimes innocent people may be recruiting them, and they might get entangled into a huge trafficking case.
Yep.
So that domestic workers law, the placement agency law, is the need of the time, and we need to ensure that dignity to domestic workers is given.
Yeah.
And we have also to realize that this is organized crime of trafficking, and legislation is required. And not only legislation here in India, but in terms of Kasturi case also, the recruitment agencies, the Ministry of
Ravi,
Overseas Indian Affairs, they all have to be accountable for
Yeah.
our people. And
So, Ravi,
I just
I'll- sorry.
want to make one more point. The deafening silence of government of India in the case of Gurgaon, where the two Nepali women were raped and they had given so long statements to the police. It is appalling, and it is shameful for us that we remained silent due to the Geneva Convention. We should act. If we can't act for two Nepali women, we can't act for any women in this country. And it shames me, and I think as a citizen of India, it shames everybody.
Thank you, Ravi. I'm going to come back to you about some of the issues you've raised. You mentioned the case about in Vasant Kunj, and that's the point at which I want to bring Nishtha into the conversation, because the employers in Vasant Kunj were professionals. So, in fact, can you quickly tell us, were they lawyers or were they doctors who, just outside the closed door, were extremely respectable community members, but what they were doing to this little child inside the house is again symptomatic of the invisibility of this violence. Nishtha, before we get you into the conversation, we'd like to see a clip from your film. Nishtha made a film about her relationship with her own maid called Lakshmi and Me. And that brings us further close home that it's not just the extreme ends of violence, but the inherent power structure and the disbalance of power in this relationship that we have with our domestic help. So before we talk about that, Nishtha, your film.
My morning begins with Lakshmi. She's been part of my life for the last 5 years. I think I'm a good employer. I don't beat her. I don't cut her salary when she breaks a glass. I don't even complain when she takes a day off. In fact, we don't have much to do with each other. She sits on the floor no matter how much I tell her not to. She's unable to go against this custom, and I've got used to it. But when I see this picture of us, it embarrasses me.
What is powerful about Nishtha's film is the self-recognition that it forces on all of us. We are not chopping hands, we are not, abusive, we are not violent, but we are blind to those who are making us both socially, economically, and emotionally available for our own lives, but we are blind to them. So, Nishtha, can you talk about the experience of making this film? 2 questions. What was the learning you had about yourself? And what was the learning you had about Lakshmi that you did not know before you made this film?
First, I want to say that I came from a household, we were not used to servants, or domestic help as we call them now. But quickly when I started working, and because domestic help is so cheap, you immediately get into it without really asking yourself some important questions about what is it that you're getting into. And and then 5 years passed. Of course, I had a very friendly relationship with Lakshmi, and there was a moment when there were visitors in my house, and I introduced Lakshmi to them. And my friend, he shook hands with her, and she was completely surprised. Nobody had ever done that with her. Nobody had shook her hand. And that for me was a very, it was a moment when I started thinking, shit, what, I've never done this. And myself, and that's when, I started thinking about all these things, about the invisibility of workers in our home. Like, we will come out of our apartment and we'll be walking, and there'll be a watchman, and that watchman is a watchman and not a person. Like, we are not recognizing people as persons. But more than that, it's also the salaries. I mean, the salaries that we give to our domestic workers is like something that you'd spend on a dinner. And so it's extremely, and these contrasts and these contradictions, these ironies don't shock us. We are so used to it. So the film is really about a sense of entitlement, a sense of privilege that we exercise on a daily basis in our everyday lives. Yeah.
So, Nishtha, your film starts with a very powerful moment. I'm sure the audience got it, where Nishtha's at the table and she just unconsciously lifts her feet while Lakshmi cleans it. And you're completely unaware that someone's cleaning, and you've just like shifted your feet. So, like I was saying, Nishtha, that can you share with us how Lakshmi became a person for you? You said that, yes, you were a feminist. You refused to do housework yourself when you were a child and your parents wanted you to do it. But how did Lakshmi become individualized for you by doing this film? Can you share a moment with us?
Yeah, I think I had a sort of a friendly relationship with her, but what did I know about her? What are her compulsions? And something I spent 2 years with her, like filming, and I realized how precarious her life is. There is no security net. There is nothing to fall back upon. I mean, they may work 10 homes, but at the end of the month, if there is an illness, if she suffers an illness or her family suffers an illness, there's nothing. You have to take a loan, and then you have to pay back the loan, and anyway you get a pittance of a salary. So you're caught in that vicious circle all your life. And I just want to tell you an interesting statistic that I'd come across, that when there was a survey done amongst non-unionized sex workers, 70% of the women had moved from domestic work to sex work. And they preferred to do sex work than domestic work because of the salaries, and not just the salaries, and other abuse and general loss of dignity that happened during their work. So it is interesting that domestic work no longer is considered something that, it would be the last choice, because we have lost out on the feudal patronage, which was bad. So you have feudal wages now, and you have a capitalist alienation. So we are caught in this really a trap in between, which is really the worst for the workers.
We are completely out of time, so I'm going to quickly run through you again and ask you for one quick, immediate priority solution that you would want. In the Gulf countries, what's the immediate step you'd want, Ratna?
So I would call on the Indian government to pressure the Gulf states to reform the kafala system. It is at the root of why so much abuse and exploitation goes on. We've obviously heard about why we've got domestic workers facing abuse in India, but in the Gulf states, they have no one. When they're abused, they have nowhere to go, and they will be arrested and deported.
And they don't know the language.
And they don't know the language. There's a whole host of reasons for why they're so vulnerable and isolated, and as you say, behind closed doors.
Yes. Ravi.
Human rights are non-negotiable. We need to speak up. We need to give dignity to our domestic workers. We need to ensure that they get justice, and we need to ensure that they enjoy the life as we enjoy.
Domestic workers are not help. They are workers, and they need a worker status and everything that goes along with it, be it wages, pension, medical allowance, medical leave, etc., all that. So they have to be treated as workers.
Yes. I think the most powerful thing that Nishta just said is that domestic workers now prefer to be sex workers rather than domestic help. There can be no greater indictment of all of us than that sentiment. Lakshmi in the film, in fact, when Nishta is filming her, she says, if I was a boy, she says, what all do I have to do because I'm a woman? If I was a boy, I would have learned to drive a car. And there are other women in that film. The one thing they ask, even before money, even before better working hours, the one thing they uniformly ask is for more dignity. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you, all of you.